My ice may be a little cold, but your crime has put completely on hold. I'm going to be reviewing the first 5 episodes of Tiger and Bunny. I think that this show is really, really good, and I think reasonably not enough people know anything about it. I really like this show. Ultimately, I'm going to try to break this show down in a little bit of a cryptic sense. But then ultimately, I'm going to break it down even further after that into spoiler like sense. And I think spoilers are probably going to be much more all over the gosh darn place. Because this show does go pretty much all over the place. So, reasonably, I'm going to try to break down this show as best as I possibly can, with hoping that it doesn't take longer to uh, explain the show and spoil the show and all kinds of things. I'm hoping that this is going to be this will go reasonably well. I don't know. So let's go on here. So this show ultimately feels to me, if you like superhero shows, this is the show for you. If you like very much this show like The Boys, if you have been able to see a show like The Boys because you're XYZ age, then you will like this show. We end up having it to where superheroes have gone into a very much corporate like agenda. We end up finding out that seemingly that superheroes are working with are working with the news. They put on a hero TV show that is to have these people have their lives consistently monitored and cameraed and whatever. Like, so basically, we have superheroes that are having a reality show, and but they do have their own private lives. We end up having it to where a character like Wildcat tries to seek tries to have his identity kept secret, but how long can you really go and do that, to be brutally honest? So we end up having it to where seemingly there is some system to go along with all these heroes where they have to get these hero points. It seems that every time that seemingly people end up going and arresting some person, we end up finding out that they end up getting hero points. We ultimately have it to where seemingly at the end of some season, I guess, that we end up having it to where ultimately like people are to get hero points and I guess get a big reward after that. It seems like there is a hero called Sky High that seems to be busting more crime than anybody else, and it seems that he is overall, I think, the anchor of this quite possibly reality superhero thing. So going on into here, we also have some learning blocks for some people that like they have to learn like what they really want to do with their lives. We end up having a character called Blue Rose, which ultimately has to deliver that quote every single time she ends up doing a crime. She ends up having to deliver, "My ice is a little cold, but your crime has been put completely on hold." Like, she has to bust out that rhyme every single time that she has to go and do her business. And so we eventually end up finding out that this character ultimately has her own agenda besides being a superhero. We end up having it to where some of these characters we eventually find, like Bartleby, like has his own like backstory that we're slowly but surely getting to learn eventually. But the most interesting character is the Wildcat character. Of course, he is kind of the like I would assess like he's kind of the veteran superhero to all of these much more younger guys. We eventually have it to where we have Rock Bison that he is kind of like the muscle bound guy. We ultimately end up finding out so as well as we also have Fire Emblem that he is really a very unique superhero, and I kind of like the approach of Fire Emblem just because like his gear is like really unique looking compared to everyone else's. Uh, even like whatever. Like so, I kind of enjoy Fire Emblem just because he's just kind of has a very different skewed visual compared to everybody else. But also we also have Dragon Kid, which I think her visuals are kind of interesting, and so on and so forth. So but anybody could say, "Oh yeah, Cyclone's my favorite," or "Whoever's my favorite." We end up having Cyclone, who's like a speed demon, like a Flash, or just a really quick character, which anybody could like that kind of character. So, anyways, we end up having to where this main story, and I'm gonna tee this up quickly and then go into spoilers. We end up having it to where Wild Tiger ends up forcibly ending up working with this character called Brooks Jones or Jr. And we end up finding out that both of these characters both have the exact same power. It seems that ultimately they can turn on this super powered ability for 5 whole minutes and ultimately be really strong or have these like seemingly amazing abilities without things like flight and stuff like that. Like that's not exactly what they can do. Like it seems like they're just really strong, or they're kind of like I would say that they're kind of the Captain America kind of approach of being superheroes. So like it's almost kind of questionably like All Might a little bit for you anime fans out there that have seen like My Hero Academia. Like uh, Barnaby and Wild Tiger kind of remind me of like All Might with like, and plus like their moral compass is kind of really on par of just like, hey, like I don't do this to rack up points and rack up fame and rack up whatever. Like I just do it because it's the right thing to do, and that's where ultimately when people are kind of second guessing what they're doing, you have it to where ultimately you have some people that are giving them that morality approach or ploy or whatever, and that kind of goes like, yeah, maybe I should do this for the right reasons instead of just like going at it for the wrong reasons. So I kind of like this show. Like it's really fun. Like it's wildly different than I think everything that I've seen, and I think that's the thing I love about it. It's superheroes that ultimately have the corporate angle. The only thing that I feel is so similar to this is The Boys. Like this is kind of a cleaner version of The Boys. To ultimately like a family audience could actually watch this show. So like the only thing that I think is goofy about this show ultimately is just the design of all the characters. Like this show mostly kind of reminds me of like Gotcha Man crowds, where we ultimately have to where Gotcha Man feels more like Power Rangers than anything else, but it kind of also feels like this show too. So let's ultimately go into spoilers about this show because reasonably, yeah, this is a very like it's very funny, it's very like fun to watch, like great visuals. I really enjoy this show. You can ultimately see it on Netflix right now. It seems that every once in a while this show will ultimately be on Netflix, and I would always suggest it for people because it's really good. I think it's a really good show for an anime thing because not everybody likes that. But anyways, let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time we're going to spoil this show. So we ultimately have it to where Wild Tiger seems to have his own costume and his own corporate sponsors and everything along those lines. It seems that Wild Tiger is seemingly kind of a character that is kind of a man that is kind of like out of time, or like he's kind of like the Captain America character. Then when looking at it, his like he's kind of outdated. Wild Tiger really is. He's really outdated. Is how I could say for him. We ultimately have a tour. White Tiger ends up trying to desperately try and uh, early on save some people, and we ultimately have a tour. White Tiger tries to stop this rail this rail uh, thing from going, because ultimately they hold people up hostage. And so White Tiger is activating his power, but eventually we end up finding out uh, that this rail station, eventually these goons transition onto this blimp. And so we end up having it to where Sky High ends up going and ultimately getting these criminals from off this blimp, and then Wild Tiger is just ultimately just going like 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 hey, I had this first, bub. And then so because Wild Tiger very much reminds me of Wolverine a little bit here and there, so we end up having it to our course yet again that Wild Tiger, or that Sky High ultimately gets the the arrest for this, and ultimately Wild Tiger is just holding the bag. So we end up finding out that Wild Tiger ultimately loses all of his sponsorship, and his company ends up folding. Because when looking at it, it's like, yeah, like Wild Tiger had done so much damage in his past that ultimately I'm assuming that this company ended up just crumbling. We ultimately find out that seemingly in the setting of where they are at, it seems that corporations are just consistently trying to just one up one another to be the best corporation for these superheroes, and eventually just these companies crumble and they fall. So we end up having it to where Wild Tiger is like, well, what do I do? And we ultimately end up finding out that this guy had been sold to yet another company that ultimately can sponsor Wild Tiger. Excuse me. We end up finding out that Wild Tiger ends up going to this company, and we end up finding out that he is forcibly having to work with Barnaby Brooks Jones. And ultimately, it seems like both of these characters are not seeing eye to eye. It seemed that Wild Tiger had really not liked, really at all, Barnaby Brooks. To ultimately, we have it to where every single time that Wild Tiger sees Brooks, he consistently calls him Bunny because of his bizarrish looking ears. So, but anyways, we eventually get in a lot of these other kind of superheroes into the fold at some point. Like they kind of randomly interject themselves through any number of these episodes. We eventually have it to where there's an entire story about Blue Rose and how eventually she is uh, a person that is kind of like, well, should I be a superhero or should I sing? Like, if anything, Blue Rose was assuming that her singing career would take off if she would be a superhero, and that never happened. And so ultimately, we have Blue Rose just kind of singing at some dive somewhere, singing along, and ultimately she's just not becoming what she wants to be. She assumes that ultimately it's like, well, hey, like I can be a superhero and be in the public eye, or I can be a singer and also be like kind of in the public eye, but ultimately nobody's really giving me a second look kind of thing. So we end up having it to where so the early parts are with Wild Tiger and Bartleby, like trying to fight out these crimes, but they're really having problems with one another, and so. But ultimately, it seems that we find out that both of them ending up having one same thing in common. Both of them don't want any of the fame and the fortune that comes with being a superhero. They do it because it's the right thing. we ultimately find out that Bartleby is easily and quickly going to reveal that he is who he is, and Wild Tiger thinks that that's a dumb decision. Ultimately, it's like, no, you need to keep yourself secret. Ultimately, you might have a family or people who care about you. Where Brooks, like, will find out that he has nothing. Like, all he has is just himself. He lost everything. So, we end up finding out uh, that eventually we get to the point of they have a common interest and so on and so forth between the two, and that's what keeps them working together. Is it just like, well, hey, like, if anything, we have it to where Wild Tiger is easily going to pass the buck uh, of criminal whoever books the criminal. We have it to where Wild Tiger is easily just going and saying like, "Hey, I'll give the points to so and so other person besides me or besides Brooks." We ultimately have like points in time where we have these like big gigantic monsters coming into the fray, and Wild Tiger and Brooks are ultimately ending up just like with egg on their face, because ultimately they're just like, dude, like we're just so out of sorts and so out of sync. We have it at points where Wild Tiger and Brooks are ultimately going through simulations, trying to be able to work together, and we have it to where Wild Tiger is making dumb mistakes and not listening to Brooks because Brooks had the right decision, and so on and so forth. So we end up having it to where eventually that here's the story. So Blue Rose ends up kind of deciding whether she really wants to be a superhero anymore or be a singer. She really has to decide that now because she's been a superhero for far too long. It seems that at some points she ends up getting a little bit too out of sorts when eventually she goes and says her quote, and then there's eventually a person with a weapon at hand, and we have Door Blue Rose ends up having to like kind of run away from the crime because ultimately it's like, oh crap, I didn't plan for me to just be uh, shot at. So we end up having it to where like Blue Rose is going through the motions, and Wild Tiger and Bartleby are noticing how like just going through the motions she is, and it's like, you know what, you need to do this because you're passionate about it. You need to do this because it's the right thing. And like ultimately, if this is not what you want to do, then just like go and do whatever you were truly meant to be. And we end up having it to where Blue Rose ends up going and singing at some dive, and Wild Tiger ends up going and talking to her, and going and uh, kind of like getting to know her. And it seems like when Blue Rose and Wild Tiger get to know one another, it seems like they're connecting on things. It seems that eventually Blue Rose will eventually just really start to almost fall for White Tiger, which is absurd because she is much older than he is. We end up having it to where Wild Tiger ends up like joking around with her. It's like, are you sure you're even old enough to drink? When ultimately she's at this bar, this dive. Um, so eventually, Blue Rose eventually is singing, and we end up finding out that it seems that Rock Bison and the Tiger and Bunny go out to try and save this civilian, and like this civilian is heavily under this rubble. And we have people at this dive while this girl is singing, taking bets whether they save the guy or not. And we end up having it to where Blue Rose ends up leaving the bar, upset to ultimately go and get her superhero suit on to try and save uh, Tiger and Bunny and Bison and Sky High by freezing the water that ultimately almost comes and tries to drown them. So interesting enough, we have some episodes here. We have some very specific episodes. We end up having it to where eventually Tiger and Bunny go out and like are shooting things for this reality show. We end up having it to where Tiger and Bunny go out to like see the sights, and eventually we have it to where Tiger, ultimately, well, Tiger, we have it to where like Bartleby is asking like, "Hey, what are those buildings out there? Do they have names?" And Wild Tiger goes, "Yeah, like you know what the name of the building of that is? Building. You know what that other building's name is? Building. Hey, wow, look at that other one over there. Guess what that one's called? A building." And we end up having it to where the news reporter is like, "God, Wild Tiger, I hate you." Like, we have it to where this news reporter is like, "You know what? I think I'm just going to start just scripting everything that you are going to say." And Wild Tiger is like, "Are you kidding me? Like, no, like, you're not gonna script me." So we end up having it to where they're out sightseeing, and they ultimately went into this elevator or this building, and there's some creepy guy that seems like a mechanic that walks out of it. We end up having it to where the Wild Tiger ends up going, "Hey, is the elevator fine?" And we end up having to where the mechanic says, "Sure, it's fine. Yeah, I just had to fix some things." And we have it to where, like, I kind of like the second guessing of Wild Tiger. It's really interesting. And we have it to where Wild Tiger is like, are you sure we should probably go into this elevator? I think it might be broken." So we eventually find out that there is a bomb on the top of this elevator because ultimately there was a call that there was a bomb scare. And so we end up having Bartleby end up kind of trying to say like, "Oh, okay, I guess there really is a bomb scare, so I guess let's try to get everybody out of the building like calmly and like a normal fire drill." And so because everybody's just swooning over Brooks, everybody's like, "Oh my God, he's so beautiful." We end up having it to where Brooks ends up signing an autograph for some woman, and we end up having it to where White Tiger ends up dropping the pen and crushing the pen. So we end up having it to where eventually Wild Tiger realizes exactly where the bomb was, and it was in this elevator. And so ultimately, we end up having it to where Brooks and Tiger ending up diffusing this bomb by very creative means. We end up having it to where Brooks ends up going and like snapping some wires, but then eventually they end up trying as much as humanly possible to like kick this thing or like hit this thing out of the building, like try to hit it as hard as they can to try to get this bomb to be like knocked out of the park, kind of like a home run hit kind of thing, to ultimately get this bomb to ultimately go off outside of the building to where ultimately everyone will be fine. Because ultimately it would have been that or Wild Tiger and Brooks would have died in this building. So we end up having it to where that is of course a success. And so every single time they end up doing a mission, it's kind of interesting because there is always some kind of cost to everything. There is in one episode where it seems that a bunch of like artistic statuesque like things kept coming to life, and so Wild Tiger's like, "Yeah, we're gonna go and try to take these giant statues down," and we end up having the reporter saying like, "Yeah, no." Do not try and destroy any of these sculptures or any of these like statuesque like things because you're going to have to pay for them. like, because it's not coming out of our checks. Like, this thing is too expensive. And so Wild Tiger's like, but we need to take this thing down. It's destroying the city. And it's ultimately just like, well, yeah, but like this large sculpture-esque like thing is like $6 million or something like that. Like, there's this lavish like things that go onto these explanations for all these stuff. Anyways, so we eventually have it to where there is an episode where it is to come up that we find out that it is Brooks's birthday. And so we end up having it to where ultimately, excuse me, that they are planning this whole thing around Brooks's birthday. And so ultimately we end up having it to where I'm gonna have to pause here for a second. Okay, I just wanted to make sure that ultimately I kind of covered most of the episodes because I'm like, is there an episode here or there? Because ultimately I'm covering the first 5 episodes of this, and I don't know if I made that clear or not. But ultimately I'll make it clear in the thumbnail and the title. So ultimately going on here, so we have it to where we find out that Brooks ultimately is having a birthday. And so we end up having it to where Brooks' birthday is down, and so ultimately we have it to where Wild Tiger is like, well, hey, how about I get him a present? Like, I'll figure out something that ultimately he'll really, really want. We end up having it to where Wild Tiger ultimately asks Brooks about any number of things that maybe he'll like, and nothing is coming up. So we end up having it to where Wild Tiger says that his present to Brooks is being present with Wild Tiger. And so we end up having it to ultimately Wild Tiger is orchestrating some knockoff like crime to ultimately have it to where at the tail end of it they end up doing a surprise birthday uh, thing for Brooks. Uh, we end up finding out earlier in the episode that Brooks evidently would think that it would be a really cool thing to be able to get this giant Hercules like necklace piece that ultimately is like $6 million. And so we end up having it to where Wild Tiger is like, well, that's beyond my price range. We end up finding out that there is some villainous character that ultimately wants to try and steal this necklace as well as seeing the exact same televised broadcast as I guess Brooks did. So we end up having it to where a fake crime ends up turning out to be a real crime. So we end up having it to where Sky High, Fire Emblem, and which ultimately I haven't talked about him enough in this show because ultimately he's kind of bits and pieces there. Like at one point we end up having it to where Wild Tiger ends up having to with his new suit on. We end up having it to where Fire Emblem just keeps completely roasting and toasting Wild Tiger to ultimately try and be dissolved uh, of some case that ultimately is put up against Fire Emblem that says that like, oh well, like he's being accused of murder and there's no way that this could possibly happen and so on and so forth. So we end up having it to where Wild Tiger ends up getting blazed by Fire Emblem, and so eventually we end up having it to where Wild Tiger ends up like propping open his helmet and ultimately end up like gulping down water like crazy. So we end up having it to where okay, so we end up having it to where Wild Tiger had completely orchestrated some birthday celebration plan thing, and they did a test run where Wild Tiger is having some stuffed bunny, and so he goes off to ultimately have some guy steal his bag, and this burglar runs off, and so we end up having it to where Wild Tiger ends up going chasing after him into some dark alley. We end up having it to ultimately that Sky High is the criminal that ultimately had Wild Tiger's bag, and ultimately is pulling a gun on Wild Tiger. We end up having it to where Wild Bunny ends up using uh, this bunny as a human shield. Where when eventually we have Brooks come in here and he has to be in this play, we end up having it to where Brooks ultimately says, "Are you seriously using me as a human shield?" So we end up having it to ultimately Fire Emblem and Blue Rose comes in as criminals that are double crossing Sky High, and then eventually we have it to where when they shoot the guns off, they eventually have these flyers or flares or whatever that say like "Happy Birthday." Like they have little rolls of like things that come out of them that say "Happy Birthday." So we end up having it to where Wild Tigress is like, yeah, that worked out perfectly, and so on and so forth. And so we end up having it to where ultimately now Brooks and Wild Tiger are put into this scenario, and we have it to where ultimately the burglar is having a problem unlatching the bag uh, from Wild Tiger this time around, and we eventually have it to where Brooks and Wild Tiger end up making their way through this dark alley again, but we end up finding out that the actual thief, the villain of this story, we find out that this guy has diamond skin, and so this thief goes and steals this necklace, and ultimately there is nobody that ultimately could go up against this guy because if you shoot him with bullets, what good does that do? So we end up having it to where this thief ultimately steals this necklace, and so we end up having it uh, to where Wild Tiger and Brooks ends up bumping into this actual thief that had stole this necklace, and so instead of Sky High. So we eventually have it to where Wild Tiger and Brooks are working through this scenario. We end up having it to where ultimately the real thief is ultimately getting away, and we end up having it to where the guys are otherwise justifiably chasing after this real thief, and Blue Rose and Fire Emblem are just like, what is going on here? So we end up having it to where also Sky High is also just upset because he couldn't actually do his lines that ultimately he had said before. So we end up having it to where everybody is ultimately saying like, "Hey guys, we gotta let Brooks ultimately get this guy. We gotta have him arrest this guy because when looking at it, it's like his collar because it's his birthday." So we end up having it to ultimately we find out that they end up spill the fact that ultimately that White Tiger or Wild Tiger and Brooks's power is dwindling. Because eventually we have it to where they end up using their power, and of course they can only use it for 5 minutes. And we end up having it to where this diamond skinned guy is just taking the brunt of every single attack, and it's just like, dude, like this is nothing. So we end up having it to where they keep going at it, going at it, and going at it. And like this guy just feels nothing, and it's like, ha ha ha, like you're never gonna get me. And so we end up having it to ultimately they take down this Diamond character simply with just teamwork because eventually they completely run out of gas. So ultimately, we have it to where the Tiger and Bunny suits end up putting up this cosmetic like thing that ultimately helps them, but recently it's just teamwork and they just were able to just outsmart this character and take him down. And eventually we have it to where Brooks or Wild Tiger ends up giving Brooks, hey, like you got the necklace, technically. Like the necklace that you wanted, you got. And he's like, dude, there's no way I can keep this. Like this is basically me stealing. And it's like, well, hey, but you still got it, right? Technically. But anyway, so they end up taking down this thief and they end up kind of calling it an episode. So, yeah, I thought that these episodes were really interesting. There's a lot of skimming and trimming that I had to do within this review because there's a lot of stuff going on. Um, ultimately, I really like this show. I ultimately hope that uh, the reason a lot of people go in here and see what this show is because I really thought it's an enjoyable show. I really find it to be fun. There are a few times that I really do enjoy like ensemble pieces and stuff like that. And eventually, I guess I'll have to get back into like My Hero Academia and see where that's at. Um, because ultimately, there might be a new season or something like that. I think ultimately, I don't know where the My Hero Academia reviews are, but eventually they will get here. Because ultimately, knowing full well that they had been, like, I'm not going to do those over again. Like, there was one review where I reviewed 26 episodes in one go. So I don't think I'm ever going to do that again. Like, I think reasonably when looking at that review, I'm like, there is no way in heck I'm going to delete that review and have it not be like, no, it's going over here and it's going to be on the channel because I'm not going to try to re-review My Hero Academia because when looking at it, I could probably review it and probably actually know the names of these characters uh, the second run around. But man, is that going to take us a very long time to review all that, especially with 26 episodes in one season. Good God. Um, I just don't think I want to do that again. So, anyways, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.